Everyone, and welcome back to my channel. So in today's video I'm going to carry on from where I left off last time, carrying on reviewing in a different key. So I just got up to the bit where I was talking about the disagreement between Lorna Wing and Hans Asperger about whether or not autism should be seen as distinct from Asperger's syndrome, or whether or not they should be seen as the same condition. And Lorna Wing disagreed with Asperger. Lorna Wing thought that the condition was one, just had different expressions, whereas Hans Asperger thought that his syndrome was fundamentally different to that of Leo Kanner's. So Asperger's typical cases are very intelligent children, which is part of the reason why there was this sense that they were different to Kanner's autism. But in actual fact, Asperger didn't just see highly intelligent children. He did see children more closely closer to Kanner's syndrome. So it's not actually the case that he just saw highly intelligent children, but those were the children that he focused on and wrote his academic papers about. The word autistic, Hans Asperger said, can be applied to disturbances of quite different origins, which can and should be differentiated. In a sense, I actually do agree with Hans Asperger on that. I do think that many of the conditions that we call autism may well not be fundamentally the same. They might have different origins. They might be related very superficially, and they might well share similar genes, similar risk or vulnerability genes. Obviously there's no gene for autism, these are just vulnerability genes, but they might share similar kind of genetic relationships, but maybe that's as far as it goes. Maybe there are very distinct conditions that we all lump together as autism. There was a lot of disagreement over the validity of Asperger's syndrome. Now, an Asperger's syndrome was actually being diagnosed even before it was formally endorsed by the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, in 1992, and the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, in 1994. And one of the questions posed was, how was Asperger's different from those described as high-functioning autistic? Another question was whether or not Asperger's syndrome was a Nazi. And that question of whether or not Asperger was a Nazi was part of the reason, not the only reason. There were other reasons, but it was part of the reason why Asperger's syndrome was removed from later iteration of the DSM. Asperger focused on the boys who possessed what he called social worth, and they were later known as Aspies. I never liked the word Aspies personally. I don't really like colloquialisms. I prefer calling things by their proper names. And also this idea that they were more lightly affected, as well as not at all rare. And he celebrated how far they could go. Some could rise to high-ranking occupations, he said. Now, special education actually did have its place in Nazi Germany. The Reich allowed that disabled children who could become productive citizens should be afforded support and education to achieve that end. But the Nazis drew a line where the cost of supporting a child was expected to exceed that child's ultimate material contribution to the state. And for that child, the Nazis had no use. Life was worthless. Now, one of the issues with autism, by the way, as a concept, is that people have never meant the same thing when they've talked about autism. The definition has always been malleable. All the big autism ideas were still only hypotheses, yet they were treated as objective fact. There was a lack of a single definition for autism, even in 1968. And in 1978, there's a lack of a single definition even in 1968 and in 1978. Like if you compare the criteria in 1968 say to that in 1978, the criteria for the diagnosis are very different. So there's a lot of shifts in how autism was defined. It was a sort of moving goalpost, I suppose. There's an enormous variability of autistic traits that makes defining autism incredibly challenging. And that was what hampered Victor Lotter's effort to counter people with autism in the early 1960s. When he had to draw a line to define autism that even he considered arbitrary and subjective. But valid comparisons among populations in different eras and places are impossible when definitions are inconsistent. True prevalence would remain impossible to determine until everyone agreed on what it was they were trying to count. And then it talks about how, the constructed nature of diagnostic diagnoses. For example, the DSM retired the diagnosis of homosexuality as a mental illness in 1972, or not even that long ago. Psychiatric diagnoses are influenced not only by scientific data, but by cultural and political factors. Now, autism was not included in the DSM until 1980, in the DSM-3. So it wasn't even an official diagnosis until 1980. Which, again, is crazy when you think about it. It's very modern, all of this. And it was altered again in 1987, and again in 1994, and massively in 2013. The symptom checklist the DSM writers developed to identify those with autism kept being revised. In one edition, the patient had to match a minimum of 8 out of 16 criteria to receive a diagnosis, but in another, they had to match at least 6 out of 12. And in this case, more than 2,000 different symptom combinations could produce a diagnosis. So how are all these people the same then? It begs the question. And one of the big kind of debates in autism is between the splitters versus the lumpers. Asperger believed that he saw 2 distinctly different syndromes in his and Leo Kanner's cases. He insisted on splitting his and Kanner's children into separate groups according to key differences. He was a classic splitter. Lorna Wing, on the other hand, was a lumper. She thought it was all the same condition, just different expressions. She thought they were the same group, since the core mechanisms of autistic behaviour operated in all of them in the same way, but to varying degrees, hence the spectrum model. Today, the lumper idea is widely accepted, but maybe we might go back to splitting, who knows? The spectrum construct is not without drawbacks, and a swing back to the splitters is possible if further scientific inquiry determines that clusters of autistic behaviours that look similar in fact arise from divergent causes. I'm inclined to go with that view. I really am. It just makes sense to me on so many levels, and I think the science is also bearing this out as well, increasingly, that there are subgroups. The study of cancer actually offers an analogy. For years, cancer survived as an umbrella term for all cancers until the field of oncology learned that different cancers are in fact different, each with its own distinct biological process, resulting in a path of splitters. So autism might be plural. Autisms, each with their own genetic fingerprint, even if there are some similarities. Like obviously cancer is caused by, abnormal cell growth in all cases, but very different mechanisms. So it could be the same, something similar with autism. It might be something fundamental that is similar or even the same, but different pathways to get there. Okay, so I'm now moving on to video number 2 now.